I call the Joint Assembly Juneau School District Facilities Committee meeting to order at 12:07 PM on June 28th, 2023. Ms. Klaschewski, will you please read the land acknowledgement?
Yeah. We would like to acknowledge that the city and borough of Juneau is on Tlingit land and wish to honor the indigenous people of this land. For more than 10,000 years, Alaska Native people have been and continue to be integral to the well-being of our community. We're grateful to be in this place, a part of this community, and to honor the culture, traditions, and resilience of the Tlingit people. Gunalchish.
Thank you, Ms. Gladaszewski, Deputy Mayor Gladaszewski. Ms. Hendricks, will you please call roll?
Ms. Gladaszewski,
Here.
Ms. Hale,
Here.
Ms. Sorensen,
Here.
Ms. Treem is absent. Ms.
She's not on this.
Wool. Sorry.
Present.
Mayor Weldon is absent. Mr. Muldoon is absent. Mr. Holst is absent.
And you say we have a quorum. Thank you.
We have met quorum.
Are there any changes or additions to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on with the agenda. Are there any changes or additions to the minutes of the May 25th, 2023 meeting? Seeing none, those are accepted. There are no items for actions, so I will move to informational items. Ms. Kester, I believe the first informational item is on me. Is that correct? Thank you. I will jump into that then. I just would talk briefly about what we did at the last meeting. We reviewed and approved the goals of this committee, and those goals are on page 5. We made one small change. Thank you, Ms. Sorensen. I believe that change came from you. And that is the first sub bullet of the second bullet, which says determine the potential of repurposing space to address needs in the community, which could include childcare. This was specific to child care, and we changed it to say that it could include childcare. So those have been approved by the committee, and this is what I'll be reporting back to the assembly that we're working on. And it's worth spending a little bit of time keeping an eye on these to make sure we're moving towards them. We discussed the funding formula again at a high level because nobody wants to go into that level of detail in this committee. Not because we're lazy, because it's complicated. And we talked a little bit about the effects of consolidation. We talked about the variables to go into the matrix. So Ms. Kester introduced the variables. I see the matrix as a major work product of this committee. So we spent some time really tussling with whether those are the correct variables in the matrix. We also talked about the 6-year CIP and a condition assessment possibility. And Mr. Holst brought up a study about 5 years ago. And I believe Ms. Kester is going to feed back to us on that. And I think the next item, we can move on to the next item if there are no questions. Ms. Kester.
Thank you, Chair Hale. The next item is just a memo with a compilation of the questions that the committee asked for follow-up on. And so the first one was clarification on the occupancy numbers for the fire marshal. And so while the spreadsheet and all the information you have lists the UBC code for fire code, and that is outdated code, the occupancy recommendations from the fire marshal would not change under the updated code. So lots of changes to code between UBC and IBC, but those shouldn't affect those occupancy numbers. So just confirming that we're operating under current information there. There was questions about storage that have been answered here. The committee asked for more information on the detail for Marie Drake and Mendenhall River renovations. And you will see that there is a memo from Administrative Services Director Olin attached to my cover memo that goes into a little bit more detail. And then the last question was Member Holst, when we were talking about the condition assessment and if and I was asking the question if we wanted to invest funds in a facility condition assessment, he pointed us to a facilities master plan and that was done, I believe it was discussed in 2017. And so that's been really helpful for staff to go back and look at a lot of the information that Ms. Olin has provided you and that actually my department has been working on for improvements to facilities come from this assessment, but it says it's a lot more than a condition assessment. It really answers a lot of the questions that this committee is asking. It goes into some detail on different metrics for schools. It goes into some detail on pros and cons of some of the different facilities. So I really think it's a valuable document. And I'm so glad that we've been pointed to that. I'm not really sure at this point how to incorporate that into follow-up meetings, but I think that'll definitely be part of staff's work, trying not to reinvent the wheel. So one of the things that we will be working on between now and the next meeting is taking the facility recommendations from this document and checking off the ones that have been done so that we can know kind of where we sit per this document's recommendations. So stay tuned for more good information on that. Any other questions from the follow-up memo from the committee?
Ms. Gladchevsky.
So the 2017 document is called what, and is it online? Is it a thing? Is it when we didn't know about it really until we kind of lost track of it because it was 2017.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I have to admit I was pretty embarrassed to not be able to pull it right off my shelf, although Ms. Olin was able to pull it right off her shelf. It is called a CBJ JSD Facility Master Plan. And I think that the reason that we don't have it as an official document is because this committee never adopted the document. So there was a lot of committee work done on it up until 2017. And then the last minutes that we can find in December of 2017, the consultant has some recommended next steps, and which look a lot like the questions that you're being asked today. And the committee decided, not to follow up on those next steps, and said that, we can use this information ourselves, and so didn't extend the contract of that consultant. And then there wasn't another joint facilities meeting for 2 years. So I think that the plan never was officially adopted. And if you have any other information, this is a little bit crowdsourcing. I've been talking with staff, but I think that's why we don't have it in our official record.
So the precursor or a different version of this committee was the committee that did that, and then they stopped doing it, and then we moved on. Okay.
So where? Can you turn your mic on? Thanks.
I was gonna say, so going back to Ms. Gladachevsky's question, where can we click on that to read the whole thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you can't click on it because it wasn't, or at least it's not in our CBJ permanent records. It's probably in the documents for those meetings in 2017, but we can certainly include it in a packet for this committee and make that available.
We didn't share it for today because it's a pretty thick document. But it is readily available for us to share. And we literally found it on the old fashioned shelf, non-technical.
Oh,
shelf,
man.
in Cassie's office, because it was David Means who was in Cassie's position at that time. Mark Miller was superintendent and probably the only board member, unless it was one of Emil's years, because he was here and gone and then came back, was Brian Holst was the only existing board member that was on the board at the time that report was facilitated by CBJ. Do you have a list of names? Was I right? Did I hit that right? Mary Becker was mayor. Yep. Jesse Keel. Yep. All Jerry. Yep. Brian was the only existing board member at the time that's still here. So,
It should be.
and Rory was, yep, Public Works at the time. So
And
that's why it just wasn't really breathing and thriving in our brains
Sure.
initially.
It should be in the minute or in the, if the clerk has the packets
you would
from
think it's in there,
2017,
right?
it should be in there.
Yep, but
Yep.
we will definitely share it with you after this meeting.
And one thing that Katie and I have, are planning on doing is actually getting with the mayor and with Rory and kind of picking their brains, making sure that, because so many of us are new, just making sure that we are kind of brought up to speed on that. So we'll do that before we meet again. Ms. Gladys.
See, that is the committee that I recall that was in fact doing this thing. And I didn't go to any of the meetings, but I was on the body and they were, and then all of a sudden they just quit. And I never did quite get why they quit.
Yeah, I don't-
You know, anyway, so I'm glad.
It might be helpful if Ms. Sorensen was a part of that conversation to build the background at the same time. If you're open to that, it just might be, rather than duplicating that, it for source might be a nice way for.
To
Right.
Mr. Keel and all that, we can, but
Senator Keel. That's right. That's right.
Do a little historical,
Do a little historical digging. Yeah. And we'll kind of touch base with Rory and the mayor, and we're trying to keep it small just to really drill down and then report back out to everybody. So, okay, super. Ms. Kester, do we want Ms. Olin to go over her memo? Thank you, Ms. Olin. It's on page 7. Yeah.
So this information actually comes from our, it's called a renewal and replacement schedule that we have to perform for our 6-year CIP list. If any projects that we have put onto our 6-year CIP through the Department of Education for the legislature to fund. And due to the fact that Mendenhall River and Murray Drake renovations have both been on there. This information is actually put through this huge Excel formula that costs out and tells us and recommends when we need to do replacement of flooring or painting or interior walls of the roof or anything of that nature. So these, the information I kind of combined it down into likeness of categories, foundation work, site improvements, exterior, interior plumbing, roofing, things of that nature. And so both of these have came in around this figure. It does not look at the fact that, for instance, Mendenhall River is a copper roof that is completely different than Murray Drake, which is a flat. I believe it's actually a foam, I believe, covering at the top. So it doesn't look at the variety of different kinds. Obviously, that's going to be coming through on a condition assessment of nature that we would have an actual architect or engineering firm look at and actually give us full figures of it yet. The latest for Mendenhall River, we had a 2013 condition assessment done, condition survey of the building done back then. And so we have that information. And then Murray Drake had some information in 2015. It was an education specification survey, I believe is what it was called. And so it hasn't had a real condition survey in quite a few years. And so that would be an area that we would need to look at if we want to update amounts and things of that nature. So.
Chesky.
Just wanting to, so these are based on super old, I mean, if the condition survey is 2013, that's what the 23 million is estimated on? I mean, or
These
how
are,
good, I just want to know how good are these estimates? Are they, good or?
these are based off the renewal and replacement schedule from the Department of Education that they provide a scheduled worksheet that we perform every year for it. So it's based off of their dollar assessment and their inflation costs that they put in. So they're pretty accurate based upon their information.
sounds like a spreadsheet formula, and inaccurate, has no idea what the building actually looks like. No?
Correct. It's information. It's just a more of a 30,000 foot level based upon
enough.
it for an insurance purposes and
Okay.
things of that nature.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you very much, Ms. Olin. That was very helpful, and it was good to hear about that deed formula thingy. I didn't know about that. Thank you. Moving on, Ms. Kester. The biggie, the matrix. And can you bring us up to speed and take us from here?
Absolutely. And so this is really going to be a working meeting, so I appreciate your time. I would recommend opening your packet to page 8 and accompanying that with the draft matrix that's on the table, because what I'd really like to do today is to go through each one of the variables, go through some proposed new variables, and get input from the committee both on the definitions of the variables, the kind of how they're going to be used, and also how this matrix will be populated. You can see, while staff did some effort to populate the matrix, some of it is more qualitative and just something that, I probably don't have a lot of background, or Ms. Owen might not have a lot of background because we're newer to the community. So I am just gonna start from the top. The memo itself is divided into the variables that this committee discussed at the last meeting, which are included on the draft in front of you. And so seeking some clarity and some population of these boxes. And then the second half of the memo are things that, as staff went through trying to actually use 2 schools, and we just chose Thunder Mountain and Juneau Douglas High Schools because it seemed like a tangible universe to start from, that we thought might be helpful information for the committee. Certainly, if there are additional variables that this committee would like to see, now would also be a great time to do that, and then we can update this matrix and come back. So we'll just start under quantitative. We have enrollment versus capacity. I think that's pretty straightforward. We hunted down that information, and we understand that is just according to fire marshal. So that's the information there. I did ask Deed what the capacity numbers that they use are from, and those numbers are from how they allocate funding across the state to make sure that it's fair from a school construction perspective. So those numbers that we see when we see the spreadsheet says deed capacity are again put through a formula that the state has that's not directly tied to school performance or school safety or fire marshal capacity. It's making sure that they have kind of equal treatment across the state when funding construction projects. Any
question.
questions on that?
Yep, I do.
Ms. Gleason.
So you say there's a different number for deed. And is there some way to talk about classroom? I mean, a classroom is full, whether is used totally, whether there's 20 kids in it or 30 kids in it, seems to me, right? It's the classroom is used. So I don't know what this UBC reflects, how many people you could cram in there and not violate fire code, which seems not that useful. Or not as, maybe we need several quantitative metrics. And I don't know how the deed one is different than this one, but how do we measure the classrooms full 7 out of 8 periods or whatever? Or the classroom's only used for childcare from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. and then it's empty, that kind of thing. Is there a way to get that? No, because the thing we saw in a couple meetings ago had kind of classrooms used, but to me, it wasn't quite fair because some of them were used for after school for an hour or something, which to me is not as used as every period all day long. So is there a way to get at that? Because I'm not sure what this 73% means. You could
Maybe,
cram 23,
maybe,
7% more people in there.
go ahead, Ms. Olin, and then I'd like to comment on that as well. Thank you.
So the UBC is the fire marshal code. Basically, it gives us a capacity limit, which states that when we have the amount of staff, students, or general public into our building, that is the maximum number of people that can be in our building for fire safety. It's also for insurance purposes and things of that nature. So we have capacity limits posted at all of our schools that say you can have 696 in this building. We base it off of the number of enrollment that we have in that building, the number of staff, and we estimate the number of visitors who would come into our facilities. Obviously, certain areas get a little bit more heavily used at the high school, such as our gyms where you have a basketball game and the gym is completely full of guests and basketball players and students. And so those take into consideration during events. Sometimes we have to have actual fire marshal approval to have a certain event and a certain amount of staff or a certain number of students in a facility at that point in time. And so that number is what we use within the district to say, okay, we are at almost capacity at this building with students and staff. What do we do next? Do we need to do boundary exemptions and shuffle kids to another facility because we are at maximum capacity based upon the fire marshal's codes? And so it's more of a safety perspective than we're using every room and we have 30 kids in every room. It's more of a 30,000 foot view of a safety level.
Sure. And so what I'm asking, is there another 20,000 foot of, I don't know that you're are you at capacity anywhere? You're
Ock
worried?
Bay and Glacier Valley are both sitting roughly at about 90%. So they're very close.
I mean, when you're trying to analyze, can we consolidate schools? This metric isn't as useful as something a little bit finer. That's all. I don't know. I don't know what to do with this 70% thing.
Well, if I could just, so this is an example of, here's what the UBC capacity is, here's what the deed capacity is for Thunder Mountain. But if I could speak to that, when I've seen a list of all the schools and the capacity that schools are at, that to me is a valuable way of comparing those numbers. So if we see a school that's at 50% capacity, without getting into all of that detail, which, as I understand from Superintendent Weiss, will change every year, right? They change up how they use classrooms every year. Without getting into all of that detail, this offers us a high level view. And I don't know, Ms. Kester, I don't know if you have a thought for how to capture the sort of the classroom usage that Ms. Glaszewski is talking about. Do you have any thoughts? To me, this number works really well comparing schools.
Thank you, Chair Hill. I think that what's important is to understand the number for what it is, right? It's not empirical data that can be used to make final decisions. It's just another piece. And I think what we've tried to do in this matrix, and I think that this discussion will hopefully feather out some detail that would be useful for you, are things like the operational use categories, which are more qualitative. And so those operational use categories answer questions like how many classrooms are used for instruction, how many classrooms are used for special education, what space is used for administrative. And so it's not very qualitative. So it's difficult to be like, this is the percent. And so this is what we should do. But it is, as you state, really important when you're looking at those decisions.
Yeah, and I would just say it's necessary, but not sufficient. So I'm not saying this is dumb, but the thing you pointed out, a column that I saw, but then forgot about, this thing classroom. That's good. Maybe we could get some more of those kinds of things. And also used for instructions all day long, or used for, rally an hour a day would be helpful.
So it looks like Ms. Kester is jotting some notes and we'll tussle with that a little bit. I will note that Mr. Holst has joined us. Mr. Holst, thank you for joining us. And We apologize. It seems like there were a few people that weren't aware of this meeting, so sorry you got ambushed by it.
Chair Hill,
Yes, Ms. Sorensen.
just as a sort of internal piece to this, from my perspective, having lived in these buildings and many of them for so many years. One of the things about our schools is that they were, built and designed decades ago. So, and if we go back enough decades, basically, there were hardly any cars parked in front of a school except for the classroom teachers and the administrative assistant and the principal. That was kind of it. And so our schools don't really have available smaller learning spaces. And one of the things that education has evolved a little bit is we have more people working with small groups of students. And in doing that, one of the things that happens is that because of how schools are laid out, I would tend to go with your point that the rooms seem underutilized, but there is a great deal of difficulty in, like, you could say, well, we could put 4 groups of 5 students in this space. But as it turns out, the ambient sound in that room will never tolerate that because no one would be able to focus on anything. So some of what is perceived as maybe unused space, like say the rally room, in many cases will be utilized throughout the day by people seeking a quiet space with a table that you could put 4 kids at. So, all of these spaces get utilized. Everybody all day long, all year long is on the hunt for a place where you could sit down with one student and do an assessment, sit down. So, book rooms, you'd be amazed how all these spaces get utilized throughout the day.
Maybe we need to redesign a classroom and make it into 6 offices or something.
These are, useful thoughts.
Well, thank you.
A couple of other thoughts, if that's
Superintendent.
okay. The rally room is a good example because based on licensing requirements, we are limited on how we use it during the day and maintain a licensed childcare facility. So we can't have a class in there all day and keep it licensed because you can't maintain the standard of the licensing in order to do that. So that's an example of spaces that literally are just limited if we're going to host a licensed childcare facility. Yeah. And the other big picture thing, if you look at, for instance, our 2 high schools, while they're both not at 100% capacity, which is typical. Very few places in our country operate inside of a district, every facility at 100%. It's just not how, if that was the case, everybody would be on the verge of a construction project. It just doesn't happen that way. Everybody is somewhere, under 100% capacity. If you look big picture at our high schools as an example, neither of them are at full capacity, but if you try to put them together, they're over capacity. So we couldn't combine our high schools right now and maintain our 9 through 12 programming inside of either of those buildings. We could reconfigure and move freshmen back out of high school like it used to be in the old days, or something like that. But as they exist as traditional 9 through 12 high schools, they're both under capacity, but we don't have space for both of them in one.
Thank you, Superintendent. And I think that I just want to make sure that we all know, and I know you're not implying this, we started with the high schools not to consider combining the high schools. We started with them because that's a type of school that there's only 2 of in town. And that was sort of an easier universe to grasp than some of the other universes. So, but your point about 61% and 71% does not equal 100% is well taken. And I substitute taught at JDHS and I get what those halls were like. Whew, that was something.
Thank you. Next item on the matrix is capital cost of renovations. And if I could get some feedback from the committee on kind of what level of detail that you'd like these numbers to be. When I originally presented the matrix to you, I thought it would be useful to have data on what would extend the life of the facility for 10, 20, and 30 years. It would be useful, but do we really want to spend the money and the time in coming up with those numbers? So the numbers that you have are strictly from the 6-year CIP that the school district submits. And you have heard from Ms. Olin where they pull that information. But it kind of gets to that question of like, what level of detail condition assessment do we want to do? And I guess my recommendation would be, we do have a lot of information out there. It's imperfect information, but it provides us with kind of order of magnitude. For example, we know Mendenhall River needs a lot of work. We know Juneau Douglas needs less work because it had a major renovation in 2004. If the conversation gets kind of winnowed down, and I think you'll need to consider this actually with many of the variables, I think you will be wise just from a level of effort perspective to say, okay, that might be useful information when and if we get to a much more serious conversation about 3 facilities. And so I think a lot of these variables that would be really useful to have might be more end game variables than when we're talking about, Ock Bay Elementary that is at 90% capacity or something like that. So just to get some feedback from the committee on if this approach of using the 6-year CIP for capital cost of renovations works for the purposes now.
I am seeing thumbs up and nods, and I also, Ms. Wall, thank you, Ms. Gladchevsky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Kester was kind of leading where my brain was going, which is, I feel like my understanding of our, kind of goals is to create the matrix that will be used someday when we agree we want to use the matrix. And so from that perspective, I think filling in numbers that we have easily available is helpful to kind of see, and any work we can do now to understand what numbers would have to be calculated in the future is good. But I don't want staff spending a bunch of time doing complicated calculations if we're not actually planning on using the matrix today. I thought we were creating the matrix for future use, if that makes sense. So simple is better in my mind.
Thank you, Ms. Wall, and I understand. I agree with that, and I also to try to answer this question, I look back at the goals of the committee. One, which I said I consider a major goal, is creating this matrix to help us advise the assembly and to help future committees advise the assembly and the school board. We also have on our committee goals to forward a prioritized plan for facilities major maintenance to the full assembly, to ensure CBJ is making the most strategic investments. Even that, I think it's likely that the work that Ms. Olin described using the deed spreadsheet, whatever that tool is, that probably is sufficient for now. I think we can meet the committee goals without going into that level of detail. And it's really good to know where that spreadsheet, where those numbers come from, because that sort of is a like to like across facilities, even if the roofs are different. Okay, thanks.
Excellent input. Okay, the next item in the matrix is school size and impact on funding. If you recall, Finance Director Rogers had a memo that we've seen a couple of times, and he ran the scenarios of consolidating high schools, elementary school. There's the third grade level category there. And so this is just that number. We've talked in this committee about the qualifications of that number. There's a 4-year step down, and then there's also a 7-year look. If you would want to reopen a facility, the state requires that 7 years lapse or a very decent argument be made. So any questions on that category?
Ms. Gladchevsky.
Yeah, so this is just it's not 900,000. It's 900,000 if you consolidated two high schools into one. It's not, each cell shouldn't have 900,000. That's right. You're not 900,000 twice minus. Am I correct? I'm just trying to understand what this is trying to say.
You are correct. So we'll.
Okay,
think of a
so
better way to-
if you did the elementary schools, if you combined elementary schools, you'd get one number, not 5 numbers.
So I think if you combined elementary schools, each one, you'd lose that school and there'd be a number for that school.
Which
So
is
they would be
different than the
different.
high school numbers. The high school numbers, since there are 2, there's only one number. I'm just trying to understand. Okay, that's fine. That's
Good
enough.
question.
That's-
Thank you.
I'm good. Don't
Ms.
have,
Olin, did you want to
Yeah.
add to that? Okay, good. Thank
only,
you.
I do
don't
think
have much time.
Oh. Yeah, actually, this committee goes till 1:30.
1:30?
Yeah, if needed. Yes. Did we have anybody else? Thank you.
All right, we will keep trucking. Maintenance and operations. Obviously, this is kind of the whole nut of what you would save both in maintaining a facility, but also instructionally. And so I think that the instructional component of really of this question is critical, but I think like Assemblymember Wall said, we don't need to do that math. I mean, that is math that can't happen until real decisions are being made. So I recommend further down in the memo that we do look at maintenance and operations of the budget line item, just again, from an order of magnitude perspective. Oh, this facility is old, so it costs a lot to maintain and operate compared to the other facilities. So that is my recommendation on that variable.
Kester. And I don't know if you're the person or perhaps Superintendent Weiss or Ms. Olin. When we talk about instructional operations, what does that mean?
You fill in the blanks if I don't hit it clearly. Similar to the rally concept, there are uses, our buildings are complex places where we try to teach children and no child learns alike. So there are different programs, in each of our sites. Those are based on sometimes the type of facility it is, like Mendenhall River has very large classrooms. It's built to sustain special ed programming probably better than any other building's physical structure in our district, based on location, because we have some district-wide programs that we don't duplicate at every school for the sake of efficiency, but we bus kids from different areas to be served by that program. So the location becomes important for that special education program as an example, rather than having it at Auk Bay and having kids bused for long periods of time to get there. So the educational purposes of each building is unique and based on all the different structures of programming. We aren't like an office building where we're just looking for spaces for people that are kind of stagnant. It is a little more 3-dimensional than typical space usage because of the educational needs.
Ms. Glaszewski.
Just one question about the M&O thing. I'm not asking for details, but I thought this was going to be how much does it cost to heat the building and how much do you save to change the light bulbs and not the major maintenance stuff. That's the other column, but don't we have a number for that? Like how much it costs to quote, run Mendenhall River or run whatever, that I would think that's a number that you have that you could put in here, right?
Yes, that's the
Okay.
number we have.
Okay, so TBD just means we have that number. Okay, great. That's all.
Thank you.
All right, keep trucking along to the qualitative categories. We have and I broke out operational use into.
I have a question from Mr. Holz. Thank you.
Thanks. And I was going to say this too. He's talked about the qualitative elements to suggest that we include some sort of a Likert scale of some type, from does really well to does really poorly. But then Ms. Gladysevsky's comment made me think that perhaps in the maintenance, at least in some dimension, it might be appropriate in the quantitative side, though I know Likert scales aren't super quantitative, but that from the notion of what you made me think, Ms. Gladysevsky, was about energy efficiency, right? So for example, we're looking at that as a school district about how much it costs and saves, or how efficient these buildings are, and make some progress along those lines. I think that when we look at the facilities, just having a number, what it costs to heat is certainly a number. But if we had it could be a useful number, but the context would be if this is a really efficient building, 5-star efficiency versus a building that we know is, wasn't designed to be as efficient, would be 2 or 3 stars. I think some sort of dimension like that when we're looking at operations might be appropriate, certainly for energy. And I thought I'd mention it just now because as we talk about the qualitative pieces, I think we'll want to be thinking about some sort of way to assess, like our school board president mentioned, some of these classrooms. I think the older the building, maybe the less good it is at delivering education generally, because we've learned some things about how to structure a building. And Zantikihini has these wonderful classrooms that open up and multiple classes can meet together and they close again, that Floyd Dryden, 50 years old, doesn't have. So the Likert scale concept is what I'd like us to think about as we go through these qualitative pieces, and maybe there's a role for something like an energy efficiency on the quantitative side as well.
Ms. Kester.
Thank you. Mr. Holst, if you could send me information on the specifics of that scale, that would be a good starting place, because I do think that I understand trying to apply some quantitative variables, and that's really useful for decision making. I think part of what we'll come back to you as a committee is level of effort for doing those analyses. And I think that some of it might be easier than others. So if you can just share that information with me, that'll help me develop that further in the context of this matrix.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kester, and thank you, Mr. Holst. Moving on, Ms. Kester.
Thank you. Okay, qualitative, and the qualitative, I think, are just so important. And this conversation keeps coming back to the importance of qualitative, but the difficulty of measuring it. So it'll be good to see some suggestions on how to do that. I broke up operational use into 3 categories based on feedback from the committee. So the first one is special services that would encompass special needs in the classroom. Specific programmatic needs. I think of Ms. Sorensen when she talks about the special education room that has special equipment for children with different needs and kind of occupational therapy needs, those types. And there's lots of those rooms. So I'll keep moving on to classrooms used for instruction. This, I think, is the committee trying to get at the question that Assembly Member Gladysevsky has of like classrooms used for instruction. So we have a number, and it is classrooms used for instruction that the school district uses with deed, but the definition of instructional space through deed is different than I as a layman understand it. And so I wanted to talk through that a little bit and see how we could define instructional use in a way that best serve this committee. So maybe Ms. Olin, if you want to start with kind of how instructional classrooms used for instruction is defined according to deed and according to the figures that we have in the PowerPoint presentation that you presented a couple meetings ago.
So for the Department of Education and Early Development, their definition of instructional versus non-instructional is based off our budget codes through our accounting documents. All 54 districts in the state of Alaska use the same chart of accounts, which means we all use the same accounting account codes where we charge different things such as electricity, fuel, staffing, things of that nature. Recently, in the last 5 years, there used to be a rule that was that 70% of district's budgets has to be spent on instructional uses, and the remaining 30% could be on non-instructional. And so how they base that upon our budget definitions is that anything instructional, which is our teachers, our special education departments, our rooms, our counselors, our social workers, and even our principals are considered instructional. And then everything in regards to our administrative assistants, finance, payroll, superintendent's office, Board of Education, operations, custodial, things of that nature are all considered non-instructional. So our numbers are based upon that 70-30 split, and it's based upon our budget account codes. So for instance, when you look at those maps and things of that nature, student services department that happens to be in Thunder Mountain High School is considered instructional to us, even though it's a department, because the state of Alaska Department of Education deems that an instructional expense based upon the account codes that we use. So that's the difference in, some people may see the actual department and just people in there is just a non-instructional, but student services provide services for over 900 students within our district. So there's a difference of definition in instructional versus non-instructional just based upon the information that we provide to DEED. We don't break it down by maps and, you know, that kind of thing. So there would have to be a new analysis done in regards to that part, because we have currently just what I provide to the Department of Education for their data that they request of us.
So this, for JDHS, it says 36 of 44 classrooms used for instruction. That's applying that percentage,
Correct.
whether or not there's actually a class taught in that classroom.
Correct. So like
Is-
4 computer labs are just computer labs. There's nothing accounted for in budgeting mechanisms that goes to that computer lab, because it's a lab that's used by multiple classrooms. They schedule to go in that lab and they come back out.
So that would be considered instructional. Ms. Glasgow, do you?
So yeah, I'm just same thing, trying to understand what. So this isn't exactly a count. You didn't go count classrooms. You just applied a percentage of your budget. Is that what you just said to Ms.?
No, we
Weston?
count them. We go out and say, okay, this room is
The purpose. We find
the purpose of the room. Exactly. The purpose of the
Jesus.
room, and then that purpose of that room based upon what is in that room and how the accounting goes through that. That is how we deem it instructional or non-instructional.
Okay, I just like then an actual list of what's in and out. That's the first thing, you know, like is Rally in or out? I assume it's out because it's outside of the cap that we pay. So that would be the first. I mean, in my opinion, we might need another category, but that would require manual going and doing it by our new definition. But for me, the first thing is what exactly is in the deed list that you already have that you don't have to do anything for because you already have.
There would be very few items in the school district that are deemed non-instructional in an actual school.
So Rally classroom is instructional?
It's non-instructional. I mean, that would be it. I mean, everything else within a school district in a map study. Yeah, like that, it's actually considered instructional use.
And the only thing is like the office is not the principal's office and
The
the
principal's office is considered, but
Yeah.
the office
is
where the-
considered instructional?
Right.
Oh,
You can't operate a school without a principal. You
Right.
have to have an administrator. So
but you can't operate a school without accountants either,
without what?
without office staff.
I think that you were referring to district office staff when you, or the front office.
the front
Yeah.
office
yeah.
is not deemed instructional per deed.
The other area is in a school we do use in Juneau, and we've said this before, some department use of school buildings. So that would be considered not instructional as well. So like student services is inside Thunder Mountain, that would be considered non-instructional.
Okay, I would
that
ask that
building.
we get the list of those things. And so it's not just oral, you know, what are the things and that would help if we need to make another category that we actually have to manually make.
And I mean, that would be really hard to capture in a footnote.
Right, but I need, so they have a paper that has it.
no, I'm just saying,
Oh, to put it on here.
yeah, I'm just saying to clarify what this means, that's hard to capture in a footnote, but if there's some way of, when we, excuse me.
You have some paper. that- And yes, and as we go further into this, the analysis, maybe we need some more, but maybe this is enough for now. I mean, it's enough for now, but
I do have a question, and one of the things I want to get to next time is talking about the various sort of special schools that we have for JDHS, Ms. Olin. For JDHS, the charter school is housed in JDHS. So is that included in this instructional versus non-instructional?
It's instructional, yes. It's noted at the bottom of that operational use as 7, it says 7 JCCS.
Oh, that's what that means. So, great, thanks.
the
Yes, Ms.
computer labs are non-instructional? Oh, so the other uses, it says, so implies to me that, okay. The other uses are also instructional. Anyways, so that could be clarified. When you say other, I thought you meant the non-instructional, because there's 36 of 44. So I was like, what are the other 8? And I was trying to add them up, and I'm wrong. That's not how you meant it.
Okay, thanks. Very, very enlightening. Ms. Kester.
And I think that we are going to flag this one too for further refinement, because I think as Assembly Member Gladaszewski said, it is really key to understanding. And so it's key that we have a good handle on it. And it might be a category that is worth our own definition or another category and our own effort, but not at this time. Next item is pupil teacher ratio. I just thought it might be useful to understand best practices by grade level for student teacher ratio. The student teacher ratio is set by the school board every year, and they probably have a great handle on what it means to have certain student teacher ratios by different grade levels, but I certainly don't know that. So I can add that information if it would be useful to the committee.
I think for my purpose, just having a number to start with is probably helpful. Not having to go to that extra detail, Ms. Kester.
Okay.
Ms. Wall.
Can I ask why this is qualitative and why it wouldn't be quantitative?
Ms. Kester.
Well, the reason why in this, my reason, which has the limitations of my brain and time and energy that I spent on it, is because at the last meeting, we had one qualitative category that Superintendent Weiss defined that included pupil teacher ratio. And because that is really a decision that the Board of Education makes every year based on, so it changes every year, right? Based on the value that they place on, budget versus providing education. I kept it in qualitative. That again, it just is my brain power that I put on it. So open to any other suggestions.
Just like we talked about a little bit this last time, and I don't, like simplifying, complex ideas down to single numbers. And I know the school board could school me on all the intricacies that go into setting this and the differences in different schools and different grade levels. But what I get concerned about is that there are people out there who look at a matrix and their goal becomes, when they look at the matrix, it becomes to maximize the numbers, and they're going to go first to the quantitative numbers. And so I realize some things are not, you can't capture in numbers, but I just want to make sure that we continue to not set up something that's going to maximize the things that we may not want to maximize, if that makes sense. So this one, my understanding is, an important thing. And so if it is a number, if you can boil something down to a number, it may fit best in quantitative. And maybe it feels like splitting hairs. I just know how people often read data. So maybe a conversation for the future.
I'm not completely sure I understand you, but Mr. Holst has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And I agree with Christine. We probably don't want to spend too much time on this, but as we are often reminded at the school board, this is a resource allocation number. So, parents see that number and they go, oh, I should have, my classroom has more than 23.5 students in it. I got a bad deal. And it's not, gym classes have 50 kids in them. And we'll have in high school, we'll have a class that's a shop class, can't have more than 12 for safety reasons. So it is a really, it's a real number that we use for budgeting purposes. But it's really wise of you to sort of question that, because if we're trying to figure out good use of our spaces, I don't know how incredibly useful it is. And it's very easy to be misinterpreted. Because imagine somebody's imagining, oh, this room could hold 30 people and they only have 26 or whatever they're thinking. So yeah, good to reflect on it a little bit more. But it's important for this group to understand how we use it. It's just, how do we budget the number of teachers per building?
Ms. Glaszewski, thank you, Mr. Holst.
I don't want to, I mean, it's a number. It's a number. It should go in the blue category. I don't think it matters. I think we should just leave it. And then if it turns out not to be useful, we could take it out. And if it's harming in a way that Ms. Wall is talking about, we could take it out once we're done.
Ms. Sorensen, thank you, Ms. Glaszewski.
Well, I would like to echo what Mr. Holst said about it being a resource allocation number. And, but it's also a number that changes every year. So right now it's probably a really, in terms of quality, it's qualitative. It's probably a good number for education. But that isn't necessarily what it's going to be next year or the year after. So, I mean, it's kind of a moving target that
That's right.
just tells us how we've allocated our resources, not how many students we've assigned to each place.
Thank you, Ms. Weiss.
Which
Superintendent Weiss.
I do think, thank you, was how it was brought up initially, was just simply as one of the variables that does directly correlate to building use. And so just a recognition that the board annually allocates resources, and that's a number as an example of a resource that they allocate that directly impacts the number of classrooms that are used. And that does vary year to year. So that was the context that it was brought up, not that it would be a defining category in terms of building use, just a recognition that that's one of those levers that changes from year to year.
And I think that I would add that I think it's very important that there be a date on this matrix, because it is very, very date specific. Ms. Glaszewski.
And that there's notes that explains all these, on the bottom that says this number changes every year. That's all. I mean, or the school board does this every year. I mean, just like that, because it's right now, I mean, obviously we're just starting it, but right now it's not a thing that you could pick up and anybody could read and understand.
Yeah.
So eventually there should be notes on the bottom.
So Chair, my intention is that this memo that we're working through will become the key.
That's
to
very
the
good.
matrix.
Yeah, that's very good. Yes. And if I could just comment also, I do see it as qualitative because people in the community, when the school board has to make a decision where the pupil teacher ratio is 30, that starts to really scare people. That's a lot of kids in a classroom with one teacher. So I think I see it as qualitative because it's an indicator of the quality of the education. I also, to get at Ms. Wall's comment, I understand your caution in not providing something where people just start tweaking the numbers to get what they want. But I also think the greatest transparency we can bring to this matrix and the information that this committee provides, the better it is for people to make decisions from. Thanks. So moving on.
The next item is cultural impact, and this is where I'm really looking to the committee for some feedback on both the definition here and any highlighted additions. And I think what it's important, let's see, the definition that I have placed in here, which I believe we saw at the last meeting, is it to really talk about the culture of the facility, its place, the facility itself, right? So the cultural impact of Juneau Douglas High School and being a Crimson Bear and being an alum, and what that facility means culturally. There are different cultural implications for schools and different definitions. So I want to get some committee discussion on that.
Do we have any comments from committee members so far? Ms. Glaszewski,
Just that it'll be hard to populate this one and not be offensive.
not be
And
what?
I get people all mad about it. If you forgot to mention my blah, blah, that's all. Or whatever. It's a good start. You did a good job so far.
Yeah.
Go Falcons.
Yes, thank you.
But that gets, I mean, the cultural impact is really important to the community. And different schools have play different roles.
Oh.
To be populated. And I see that Mr. Holst has his hand up. Thank you, Brecken.
Yeah, this one is definitely tricky. One element that I think is just in this conversation where it would fit. We know, research supports that when we concentrate socioeconomic groups of the exact same type, especially low income groups, we have poor outcomes. When we have a good social economic mix, and I'm not saying that this is cultural, so I want to say that this has made me think of that as well. We know that students do less well. Students do best especially the lower income students do best in a mixed social economic environment in the schools. The wealthier kids tend to do pretty well no matter where you put them, because it has a lot to do with the family background that they have. So I don't know, I don't really see that here in these dimensions yet, which I think would be if it falls into neighborhood. I'm not sure, but I wanted to mention that as well, because my mind went to that as to what does the demographics, I think, is one way to look at the cultural piece of that building. How does that impact the performance of that school? Is that a dimension of cultural impact we want to explore?
Is that like demographics of school population? Are you saying?
Correct.
Yeah. Ms. Glaszewski.
Yeah, just to follow up on what you just said, Mr. Holtz, you mean like something like this school has 30% of these kinds of people and 40% of these kinds of people? Is that what you mean? Like
It is.
income levels and whatever.
Right, because I think if we were to make choices, I mean, at some point, I think some choices are going to be made about removing an elementary school or adding a school, and that would be a really important consideration to.
I agree.
Yeah, and I agree. And I don't know if Superintendent Weiss has any comments on that, given your, your wealth of background.
Yeah, I think it is. I would agree with Mr. Holst, and it is hard to capture exactly that element, but definitely some of that diversity in those areas happens by location, just where schools are located. So I think it is appropriate to be recognized. It's a little hard to capture, but we can work on that.
Ms. Glaszewski.
Just whatever you already have. I mean, I don't know what you track. I mean, you know how many kids get student lunch and
Yeah.
how many, whatever,
Demographics, yep,
whatever you
absolutely.
have.
We have a lot of demographics and we have that broken down by school, so we can certainly do that.
And I think that we'll touch on the article that was in the New York Times, but they touched on that. They talked about that relative to Chicago. So the schools that they closed in Chicago were in poor areas, and they said this is going to improve education for everybody. And then measurably 10 years later, it didn't. So that's really important. So thank you, Mr. Holst.
Great conversation. Impact on quality of education was brought up by the committee at the last meeting. And I think it's a really valid point, especially in and the comment was made as it speaks to the JSD mission. I just had a really difficult time as staff translating the need for that perspective into a box on a matrix. So I would love to get some more feedback from the committee on this definition, on this variable, and how you would like to see it used and defined in the matrix. Oh, yeah, that's this one.
So I hope everybody's thinking about this one. Perhaps Superintendent Weiss, and if we don't have to put anything there now, but we can just kind of make sure people are thinking about what might go there.
I think that would be a really good approach. And what we've done so far is just listed, because this one just came up at the last meeting. So we listed our school district mission statement. Because I think, again, we have to just keep circling around to that. We're a unique agency providing unique service to our community and our families. So that was a good starting place to remind us really the core mission that we have as a school district as it's articulated by the board. And then for your future work, how can you start pulling out some articulation of what that might look like, or considerations in the matrix, how that translates from that mission statement, I think would be, where you could go in the future on that.
Okay.
And or find a place in the process on the matrix where that lives, that overall mission, because it does give the broader reminder of the uniqueness of the work that we do. So it might turn out that it's a really effective, useful part of the matrix, or there might be somewhere else that it lives in the process to just kind of keep coming back to that mission that we have, that is a huge responsibility and articulated in this way by the board because it lines up with their vision.
Mhm. Great, thank you. So that's something to work on, but to think about. Mr. Holst.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far on this, but I mentioned an example I think is helpful for the committee is there are two middle schools, Marie Drake and Floyd Dryden, and they operate slightly differently, in part because of the facilities that we have at Marie Drake are different than Floyd Dryden. And
Marie Drake is not a middle school.
Marie Drake, Zantikihini. Oh my gosh, I dated myself. But
Thank you.
yes, I graduated from Marie Drake many years ago. I can't believe I said that. Zantikihini. Oh my gosh. But anyway, it is now you've discarded. Now you can listen to anything I say because you determined that I'm zonkers. So super briefly, so at Zantikihini, we bring sixth graders in, they mostly stay together. And then seventh and eighth grade, because our classrooms can open up and we do shared teaching, we have a much more opportunity for the seventh and eighth graders to mix, more similar to what they're going to have in high school. At Floyd Dryden, they try to do similar things, but it's a little harder because they don't have a single, I think they don't have a single room that actually opens up. I mean, they're very limited because their building built 50 years ago was very traditional. So it's a lot harder for them to do that. So to me, that's an example of a higher functioning building for the things that we know work well for kids.
That's terrific.
Right. So that's an example. I think, if we wanted more examples, Dee Dee knows the elementary schools incredibly well. Some are better built for what we're trying to do, and some are less perfect.
That's great. And so thank you very much. It was a really good example, and one example that I was wondering about, because the mission statement says, in order to graduate in diverse engaged citizens, well, diverse and engaged citizens is not so easy to measure, but graduation numbers are from high schools. So that might be another piece that we put there. Ms. Wall.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think that this is one that, I feel like we really need to rely on the school board to, populate this for us. I feel like from the assembly side, it's easy for us to be like, oh, this is the money that would be, if we were to consolidate two schools, this is the money that we could save, or this is the money that the additional money that would have to be spent. But that, like, what is the impact on education? I know it's not easy to summarize, but you all do it all the time in ways that I'm never going to be able to comprehend unless you can kind of spell it out for me. Here are the big things that us as decision makers should be thinking about as we, consider these decisions. So that example is a great example. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Ms. Wall. Ms. Gladys.
I wasn't here last time when you added this, so I was completely confused by the building, and Mr. Holtz explained one, so that's, if you can populate it, that'd be awesome, because I couldn't think of a thing to populate it with about a building,
That's great. Yeah, that was very interesting, actually. We're keeping an eye on the time. We're still doing okay, but we'll keep moving. So Ms. Kester, and this is really helpful. Great information, you guys.
Thank you. Okay, next is impact to neighborhood. It says in that New York Times article, when a school closes in a place, it just becomes a town instead of becoming a community. And I think that was a really good summary of what a school means to a neighborhood. Also a very difficult thing to populate, but looking for some feedback on that from the committee.
So I can think of, in my perspective, this is really going to be different for different schools. So the Ock Bay School is sort of, it's the only city facility other than fire stations at that end of town. There's nothing else at that whole end of town. So and I actually don't know how much the Ock Bay School is used for community purposes. It has a different nature than many of the other schools. Glacier Valley is another example because it's been there for so long and it's so centrally located. I don't know that I can put in words the sort of the impact to the neighborhood, but that one's pretty central, I think, to that whole part of the valley. So this might be something that we have to sort of grow into as similar to the last one. Great. Thank you.
All right, I'm just gonna keep trucking, and when the chair stops me, we will add the items to the next agenda. This section is proposed additional variables. And again, they're just things that as we went through it, thought may be useful, may not. And so predicted enrollment was a variable that I think is not as simple to calculate. But for example, we have a report done by Greg Erickson that says in 10 years, what he predicts the enrollment will be for high school grade levels. He doesn't predict Thunder Mountain JD, but he says, I believe this will be the enrollment in 10 years based on these variables. And so I just wanted the committee to think about that prediction piece and how it might be helpful. For example, you could say, 50% enrollment, we don't really want to think about, it doesn't really become useful until it's below a certain percentage of capacity. I think we talked about the challenges already about that number of the capacity number and what it really means. But just trying to ask the committee how that more forward-looking quantitative data could be interpreted usefully for your decision-making purposes.
Ms. Glaszewski.
I would be all for something in predicted enrollment. Whose predicted enrollment we use is will be a question, but we should try to populate that, I think. state demographer has numbers of ages of people, maybe, you'd have to go data searching. But we should try and then put all the caveats on it that you put.
I wonder if would the committee be interested in some additional work by Mr. Erickson? I don't know that it would be really expensive. He's already got the information. Is there an interest if that's what was required?
I would say if that's what's required, but first look at what the demographer has, and I don't know, I just haven't looked at that stuff in a long time. We have a state demographer and that's what they do. So I don't know if apparently it's not good enough if we've hired Greg to refine it. So I just don't know enough about it at this moment. I used to, but
Thank you, Mr. Holst.
Yeah, I've had a chance to talk to folks about this. What Greg does for us is the short-term stuff is really valuable. What the state demographer does, and they have this data for us for Juneau, which Greg's one of the items that he uses, is very good. You just have to remember what the demographers, how they use their projections are based primarily on history. So what happens in a place like Juneau, which could be fine, but where they really have trouble is under what scenario. So you as an assembly say, hey, our scenario is that we want to have additional seniors housing we're going to build. We're going to do these other items that influence our economy. Unless you propose future scenarios, they're just going to give you based on how the current population is evolving. And that's a useful piece of data. So for Erickson, the value of Erickson would be give him scenarios that you'd want to say, well, if Juneau were to do this or that in the next 10 years, what would it look like? Otherwise, I think we just go with the demographers because they're basically projecting, they have projections on their website for the next 50 years for Juneau.
Great, thank you. Ms. Glaszewski.
I just wanted to get some of that on the matrix and we can debate which is better or if we need different later. That's all.
Great, thank you. Ms. Kester.
Thank you, Chair Hale. I'm going to go ahead and skip over the next one because we covered it before. This would be where we include the budget number for maintenance and operations like the janitors and the small scale maintenance. The last item I thought about in these variables before we move on to opportunities is the cost to mothball. Again, I don't know how useful that information is, but if we abandon a facility and don't find an alternative use, there will be a cost of minimal heat, minimal electricity. And so we can come up with those numbers if that would be of use to the committee or not.
Ms. Glaszewski.
I would say that would be for later. I mean, so it's just to work in case, eventually if we get there or something, but I don't think you should personally spend time on it now. I mean, the repurposed at what cost is a useful thing to write, I think, but cost to mothball is way down the road.
Yeah, so super. And, maybe we leave it as it is for now, and then we think about whether to take off at what cost, because you're right, we'd have to figure it out at the moment. I think also, oh, go ahead. It's on here. You've got it.
Right. So under opportunities, I think these are really important variables because, and it gets to the conversation you just had, if you mothball a facility, that might not really be worth it to anyone. But if there are very pressing alternative facility needs in the community, then it becomes a different conversation, right? Whether or not it's worth going through that exercise. And I think every facility has different potential alternative needs that it could serve. We've talked about childcare. We haven't talked about others. So again, I think this is a difficult column to populate when you're not looking at like every single facility. And I also think it might not be worth populating it for some facilities, right? I mean, if closing Thunder Mountain is probably very, very, very unlikely, we just move on. So, but wanted to flag that and get any feedback from the committee on that.
I don't see feedback right now, but, I don't see feedback right now, but, there are uh, there's growing senior population, is there the possibility of, gym facilities for seniors, specific for seniors? So I think maybe you're right. Maybe we leave that. And as we grow the matrix and put more facilities in there, and as we get closer to thinking in the future about what, if we might be decommissioning a school, what are the alternate uses? That's great.
And similarly, the next, can it be repurposed and at what cost is key to the whole conversation, but needs more detail because as this committee's pointed out, even if you're going to renovate a facility for childcare, there will be a cost both for the change of use and for some of the same structural deficiencies that the school district has identified through their condition assessments. So important categories that probably will be populated at a later date.
So thank you very much, Ms. Kester. This has been great, and I think we've given you a lot to go back with. I just want to mention to everyone, Ms. Kester, if I may take it over now. Super, thank you. The article that I included, and Cassie, thank you for printing that. I think it's really, really what we're doing here, and it really got to some of the core issues. And I'd like to talk about the date and the topics for the next meeting. We had tentatively set August 3rd, noon to 1:30. If that's a problem, please let us know. The topics, Ms. Kester, two topics come to mind. One is to continue diving deep into the matrix. And the second is I'd really like an understanding of Yakutsk, Montessori Borealis, and the charter school, just so that I have an understanding, and probably also the Tlingit immersion school. So I have an understanding of, we as a committee have an understanding of, what like a charter school, well, where does their charter come from? What are the requirements of each of those individual separate schools within a school? So perhaps the school district could work on that for the next meeting. Ms. Kester, have I left anything out that we were talking about for the next meeting?
The only other item here we talked about at the beginning of the meeting, which was the review of the comprehensive facilities plan. Again, I think we need to spend some more time understanding it to make sure it fits well within the committee work now.
And we'll give an update under information items.
Just one more thing on future meeting date, that's August 3rd. And I want to take a little bit of responsibility for the fact that I know some of the members weren't aware of the meeting date. We did send out a poll originally. I don't know what follow-up we did or didn't do, but in the future, we will make sure you both have a meeting invite and an email confirming the time for a meeting. So apologies for any of you that lost track of that.
My problem, not.
No, I mean,
Helpful, but I'm so sorry.
yes, thank you for that. You're so kind, but yes, we should be able to maintain calendars. But I failed.
We're all supposed to be good at it by now, but it's hard.
Sorry.
All right, well, the meeting is adjourned at,
Unadjourned.
not adjourned. Dr. Weiss,
Yes,
this is your last week,
it is.
and we just want to say thank you. We could sing a song if you'd like.
For a dance. Oh.
Thank you so much for everything you've done, and I know you're going to continue. So we just really wanted to thank you for not just your work on this community, but all of this committee, but all of the sometimes really hard presentations you've had to do before the assembly. Thanks so much for everything. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Now we're adjourned.